Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nerily Duffy, and I'm the head of Digital Communications and Marketing here at Carlow College. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second lecture in our Leaving Cert lecture series for 2024-25. This lecture series has been designed to complement your studies or for teachers for their student studies across a range of Leaving Cert subjects, including English, history, politics and society, classical studies, and religious education. For today's lecture, we'll be focusing on European history with Dr. Ida Milne as we explore the rise of fascism. Dr. Ida Milne is a lecturer in European history here at Carlow College, and her principal areas of interest lie in the history of health. Dr. Milne has been a regular media contributor over the last number of years on the impact of infectious diseases and how they affect healthcare and society. For today's lecture, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you'd like to post any questions for me to put to Ida at the end of the session, you're more than welcome to. Just pop them in during the session and we'll visit that at the end. We'll also be publishing the full lecture on YouTube, and we'll send the link along with the lecture slides to all attendees after the event. So now I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Ida Milne for today's lecture.
Hi, Nerily, and thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for tuning in on this lovely foggy day here in Carlow. What we're going to look at today is the interwar years, and really just at the very beginning of the rise of fascism in Italy and in Germany. And I suppose it's a subject that's very close to a mirror experience of what's happening in the world at the moment with the rise of fascism internationally. And particularly, I suppose, the big fear that it may rise in America as well. So what we're looking at here is, what is fascism? What were the conditions for the rise of fascism that emerged in the interwar period? We look in brief at its emergence in Italy and Germany, at where it spread, and then throughout, really, have we similar conditions today? And can history repeat, or, to paraphrase Seamus Heaney, can it rhyme? And I think that's really kind of pertinent because some of the big theorists about fascism say that it's not the same in every country. It has a unique nationalistic flavour in each country that it arises in. So in the aftermath of the Great War, there were really two key polarised political tensions emerging. On the one hand, you had socialism and communism as the seeds sown by the Russian Revolution spread. There were workers' movements across Europe, and they were open to this new idea about the formation of society by the people, for the people, with communal ownership, particularly of businesses or communes. And on the other hand, then we had fascism, which in some ways came about as a foil to the fears of socialism and communism, and in particular by church interests. And we see that in Irish newspapers, Irish sermons all the time, that the fear of the red threat is mentioned in those sources from the time. So fascism is a right-wing movement grounded in extreme nationalism, and it gathers momentum in the wake of the Great War, which of course later became called World War I. And it is something of a foil to the spread of socialism, the Red Scare. So these two political movements really came to dominate European politics in the interwar years, and also led to World War II, and contributed to what I've lived through for most of my life, was the Cold War. In the USSR, communism came to be really dominated by another form of totalitarianism, by Stalinism. In Italy, there was the rise of Italian nationalism and the cult of Mussolini. In Germany, we had National Socialism, or Nazis, and Hitler. Spain, we had nationalism under General Franco, and the Spanish Civil War led to a totalitarian regime, which wasn't as extreme as that in Italy or Germany, and probably therefore lasted until the 1970s. Examples of contemporary totalitarian states included Mussolini's Italy, Stalin's USSR, Hitler's Nazi Germany, Mao Zedong's People's Republic of China, and Franco's Spain. So both systems, non-democratic systems, led to totalitarian regimes. Fascism for most of my life was considered to be a phenomenon of the interwar period, and that it really could only happen then. And if you mentioned 20 years ago that fashion could happen again, you'd be told very quickly by your history lecturers, oh no, that only happened in the interwar years. So it occurs in a critical period of modern European history. And I suppose because of the key factors that happened at the end of the First World War. Um, there is the trauma of the war, the collapse of the big empires, Germany, Austria, Hungary, etc. The peace process, the creation of new countries, and the growth of communism really bring about a lot of political tension. And one of the legacies of the chaotic state of Europe after World War One and the very unsuccessful Versailles Peace Treaty, which was really created by an imbalance of power in the negotiations, is the rise of fascism as a political force. Here in Carlow College, we teach a Rise of Fascism module. It's really popular with students because it's very much hands-on. We discuss fascistic movements and explain why fascism was successful between the wars in Italy, Germany, and Spain, and other Central European countries. And then with the rise of Putin in Russia, Trump in America, Viktor Orban in Hungary, we give students the chance to say, like, how would you assess other European and international countries in terms of being fascist in the modern world? And students really become very much engaged with this. And they bring in cartoons and they bring in news stories and things like that to argue the case for what they think is happening. So the conditions for the rise of fascism, the end of the Great War brought an uneasy peace. The peace treaties produced a legacy of profound instability, which was exacerbated by nationalist and ethnic tensions, which left Germany defeated and bitter. The war turned around really quickly, as most of your history teachers, you'll be well aware of this, that when Germany was able to close down the Eastern Front, they really thought they had the winning of the war once Russia had left because of it had entered revolution. And all of a sudden, the war had just literally disappeared from them for a variety of different factors. So it was quite a hard thing for Germany and German soldiers to get used to the idea that actually they weren't going to win the war and they were going to lose it. And this was something a very young Hitler, when he was gassed, when he had been gassed during the war, he thought, as he went into hospital, he thought Germany was going to win it. And when he had recovered and woke up, he discovered Germany had actually lost the war. And it was something that he often referred back to in speeches, but also in his texts. So the Treaty of Versailles is now seen as fundamentally flawed and overly punitive on Germany. Clemenceau, in particular, really wanted Germany to be punished. And when Woodrow Wilson wasn't as well as he might have been during the negotiations, he'd suffered from Spanish flu and other illnesses. He wasn't able to temper and to argue back that over punishing Germany was not a good idea. Similarly, Italy, though technically on the winning side, felt it didn't benefit enough in the negotiations. The Versailles Treaty also produced the League of Nations, which was really the first experiment in collective security. And it too was handicapped by these tensions and by the fact that, despite it being the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson, that the American Houses of Parliament wouldn't let America join it and wanted to retreat back from the world stage for a while. So his big idea was really fundamentally flawed because the US couldn't join it. So there was also economic instability caused by the Versailles Treaty and generally around in the 1920s anyway. This was foreseen by the young economist John Maynard Keynes, who was part of the British delegation at the Paris Peace Conference. And he foresaw that being overly punishing Germany, making them pay too much in retribution, in contributions to make up for the damage they caused during the war, would lead to Germany becoming more belligerent once again, re-emerging as a power, as a militaristic power. The economic instability culminated in the Great Depression of 1929 and contributed to Europe's political difficulties and to the spread of fascism in the 1920s and the 1930s, and in particular in Germany. There was also, in the wake of the war, a lot of post-war malaise and a customization to violence. You could talk about this in terms of masculinity, that soldiers are returning home from the war. They're accustomed to killing, and they come back into domestic societies where, in many cases, they couldn't find jobs. And it affects their psyche. Many of them suffered from depression from what they'd seen at the war, form of PTSD, I suppose we think about it as today. And it wasn't really possible for many of them just to settle back into what they had been doing before. And this has an impact as well. There's also the fact that this is very much a time when media are growing. Radio is the new wonder child, I suppose, of communication at the time. And it enabled radio, and then later in the fascist period, film enabled fascist dictators to very much spread their message and to control what was being shown and said about them. John Maynard Keynes was the most influential economist of the 20th century, and he was a very young advisor to the British delegation in the peace negotiations. And he really bitterly disagreed with the Treaty of Versailles and attacked it in a book published in 1920 called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. It became an international bestseller. It's easily available on the internet. It was an indication that at the time that many people were really uneasy about these punitive terms of the treaty. And he really was prescient about dangers that would flow from such an equitable settlement. Keynesian economics is the principle that a focus by governments to encourage spending helps to curtail or prevent economic recession and to protect employment. And that is really what's at the heart of the economic practice of the European Union and American US economic practice generally to this day. But again, it may well change under the incoming regime. So how do we define fascism? Well, the term originally comes from the Italian word fascio. My Italian isn't good, so please forgive my pronunciation. The plural is fasci, meaning bundle. So the symbol is a bundle of sticks tied together. Politically, it means union or league. It's not so much, some people would argue, an ideology as a form of government that's anti-liberal, violently exclusionary, and nationalistic. It's associated with a political philosophy and a movement, and of course it is particularly associated with Nazism and with the interwar period. Its practice takes different forms of identities in different countries, but essentially it's authoritarian and promotes a certain kind of intolerant and extreme nationalism and the identity of a particular folk or people. And also it focuses very much on excluding and creating others. Robert O. Paxton was one of the first academics to study fascism. He was a sociologist at Columbia University, and he defined fascism as a form of political practice distinctive to the 20th century, of course it no longer is, that arouses popular enthusiasm by sophisticated propaganda techniques for an anti-liberal, anti-socialist, violently exclusionary, expansionist, nationalist agenda. He says in The Anatomy of Fascism, which was published in 2004, that it may be deformed as a form of political behaviour, marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, with humiliation, with victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in an uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. He defines 5 stages of fascism, and this is something that I use constantly with my students when something happens in the world, in movements that you could describe as right-wing at least. And I'll say to them, what is this? And we spend a half hour teasing out, where does this fit into Paxton's stages of fascism? You can see them more clearly on this link to J. Storr. One of the articles that he wrote is there. So the first stage is the initial creation of fascistic movements. This is long before we have it in government. And then that they become more identified and rooted into parties as political system, in a political system. For example, that you could have the gangs that typically come with fascist beating up people as part of the party political process. And this was really the early stage that happened in Nazi Germany in 1922 and in Italy in the same period as well. That then these parties, these movements get power, and ultimately that they come to hold government, and how they do it, and how finally in the longer term they become radicalized, and that they merge into totalitarian states. And he says that Italy and Germany only really achieved this in the interwar period. Fascism still exists and remains a threat today. In several different places in the world. In 2021, just as people were thinking about the longer term impacts of COVID, the British Army Chief of Staff, Sir Nick Carter, warned that today's conditions were fertile ground for the growth of fascistic type movements. What do you think about that? What signs do you see? He argued in, I think it was a Daily Telegraph article in 2021, that the COVID-19 pandemic and a possible associated economic downturn, which I think every country was looking at, even something like the COVID dole was seen as a way of promoting Keynesian economics, that people could keep spending, even though they weren't earning or might have lost their jobs during COVID. So the associated economic downturn, as well as the contemporary rise of the far right, which was already happening in that period, could lead to increased popular support for that far right movement. And he argued that the 1918-19 influenza pandemic had contributed to the rise of fascism on the interwar period. And when he said that, I got a lot of calls to say, how was this linked? And I had to think about it a bit, but there's been quite a few studies done on that since, in the light of the rise of the far right and of COVID, and looking back at 1918, 1919. And in particular, there's 2 studies in Germany and in Italy, which support the argument that he made. They show that there's a correlation in both countries in voter support for fascist parties in areas with higher deaths from the 1918-19 influenza pandemic. The analysts, one was done by the US Federal Bank, the Fed, went back to look at the vote in the light of extremism surging during the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of the possible suggestions for the link were that in areas worst struck by the pandemic in Italy and Germany, there was less spending in the post-pandemic years as a result of the higher deaths in a key sector of the workforce. The 1918 flu particularly hit young adults, who would be, a large part of the workforce. 20 to 35-year-olds were disproportionately affected. The other study done was that it was published in the American Journal of Health in Public Health in 2022, and again, freely available online at that link. And it looked across Italian cities and found a correlation between areas where there had higher deaths from the flu and areas that voted more strongly for fascism in the early elections in Italy under Mussolini. So fascism has come really to be associated. The first things that spring to mind are Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, and then Benito Mussolini and his brown shirts in Italy. But it's part of a much wider movement across Europe and other parts of the world, and existed to a greater or lesser extent in most countries, including here in Ireland, where we had General Owen O'Duffy and his blue shirts, which was a very small movement, somewhere between 8,000 and 30,000, depending on which figures we go with. And of course, Franco Spain is another example as well. Part of the key features of fascism include excessive displays of military and civilian strength, which is really an essential part of the propaganda, and showing everybody is with us. How can you be out? Is there? You can look at these slides in your own time. If I put them up now, it'll stop the whole video, from British Pathé and from YouTube, where you can see some of these kind of displays of military strength. But here's one of Nazi stormtroopers listening to Hitler at a rally in Nuremberg in 1933. And again, there's a uniformity, the idea that everybody is with us and that we have this vast military strength, which also, I think, implies civilian control too. One of the key philosophers about fascism in the 21st century is Yale academic Jason Stanley. You'll find loads of videos of him, but he's written a book called How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. So he says, I think of fascism as a method of politics. It's a rhetoric, a way of running for power. Of course, that's connected to fascist ideology, because fascist ideology centers on power. But I really see fascism as a technique to gain power. People are always asking, is such and such a politician really a fascist? And we've heard this over and over again in the last few years about Donald Trump. And Paxton, for example, would have said 2 years ago that he wasn't, but now he thinks that the movement is fascistic. Stanley says, what is really just another way of asking if this person has a particular set of beliefs or ideology. But again, I don't really think of a fascist as someone who holds a set of beliefs. They're using a certain technique to acquire and retain power. He says that his book identifies various techniques that fascists tend to adopt and show how someone can be more fascist or less fascist in their politics. And that the key thing is that fascist politics is about identifying enemies, appealing to the in-group, which is usually the majority group, and smashing truth and replacing it with power. He says, I think it's clearly right-wing. Part of the problem is that right and left are tricky to talk about, and it's true that there's some dangerous forms of extremism on both sides, but fascism tilts pretty heavily to the right in my view. If you think about fascism as a sliding scale, he says, ordinary conservative politics is going to find itself somewhere on that scale, which is not to say that it's fascist at all, any more than ordinary democratic politics is communist. But just as the extreme versions of communism suppress liberty on behalf of radical equality, so too do extreme versions of right-wing politics, namely fascism, suppress liberty in favour of tradition and dominance and power. He himself specializes in the use of propaganda to persuade, to discuss it and analyze it in an academic fashion. And he says, on the past, fascist politics would focus on the dominant cultural group. And the goal is to make them feel like victims, to make them feel like they've lost something, and that the thing they've lost has been taken from them by a specific enemy, usually some minority outgroup or some opposing nation. And he says this is why fascism flourishes in moments of great anxiety, because you can connect that anxiety with fake loss. He says the story is typically that a once great society has been destroyed by liberalism or feminism or whatever, and you can make the dominant group feel angry and resentful about their loss of status and power. And he says almost every manifestation of fascism mirrors this general narrative. He talks about the destruction of truth as being really important to fascist rule. He says that's important because truth is really at the heart of what we perceive to be the norm, liberal democracy. The two ideals of liberal democracy, he says, are liberty and equality. If your belief system is shot through with lies, you're not free. He says no one thinks of the citizens of North Korea as free because their actions are controlled by lies. Truth, he says, is required to act freely. Freedom requires knowledge. And in order to act freely in the world, you need to know what the world is and what you're doing. You only know what you're doing if you have access to the truth. So freedom requires truth. And to smash freedom, you must smash truth. So the idea of undermining newspapers, television channels who disagree with you, fake news, is a way of smashing truth. Creating the concept of fake news is a way of smashing truth. The interviewer in this online interview said there's a great line from the philosopher Hannah Arendt, I think, in her book about totalitarianism, where she says fascists are never content to merely lie. They have to transform their lie into a new reality and persuade people to believe the new reality they've created. And Stanley says, I think that's right. Part of what fascist politics does is get people to disassociate from reality. You get them to sign on to this fantasy version of reality, usually a nationalist narrative about the decline of the country and the need for a strong leader to return it to greatness. And from then on, their anchor isn't the world about them, it's the leader. So this was very much something that Mussolini did in fascist Italy, the idea of going back to the Roman Empire and re-achieving its greatness. And of course, it's the key concept behind MAGA, Make America Great Again, too. Stanley says that the thing is, people willingly adopt the mythical past. Fascists are always telling a story about a glorious past that's been lost, and they tap into this nostalgia. So when you fight back against fascism, he says, you've got one hand tied behind your back, because the truth is messy and complex, and the mythical story is always clear and compelling and entertaining, and it's hard to undercut that with facts. And I think this is something that came up again recently in the American election. You hear people saying that the truth is messy and that a simple idea can get followers very quickly, whereas the truth is often harder to explain. So let's look in brief then at fascism in Italy and Germany, the two key countries where it becomes embedded. Antonio Gibelli looks at the weaknesses which led to the fascist system emerging in Italy. He argues that Italy's economic, political, and intellectual leaders were hungry for war in the name of ambitions that were intense but often vague. He says the results were the opposite of what they might have intended and exposed the nation's weaknesses and started the fall of the leaders who had urged it. And what does he see these weaknesses as being? Well, one is inadequate social cohesion, a lack of proper identification with the nation and with its institutions. He says that broader sectors of the society, such as the working class and peasants, and for different reasons, that the Catholic Church felt little confidence in the state or a sense of obligation towards it. And I think that's probably is a key feature of fascism today too, is there was a feeling of disconnect from certain sectors of society, that the state is not interested in them. Gibelli says that it seems like the state equally distrusted its citizens and that these tensions exploded with the test of war. He says there were lots of fears of disloyalty in the Italian army and therefore of desertion within the army. And that meant that soldiers were really very harshly treated by their superiors. He says that suspected dissidents at home were also treated really harshly. And another tension that he sees as key was wartime deprivation. The people felt resentful towards the elites who had pushed the country into the situation. And I suppose they don't see themselves as not being a unique, that this is something that was experienced right across Europe because of the war. But you're blaming the immediate and the government that's out of touch rather than the fact that it's an overall wartime situation. So somehow the ordinary people came to understand that wartime, despite the glory of the Austria-Hungary defeat by Italy, had somehow bought them fewer gains than losses. And this was particularly the case because Italy, despite being on the side of the Allies and technically one of the winners in the war, gained little from the Paris peace negotiations because their leader, Vittorio Orlandi, wasn't very good at putting forward the Italian case, despite being that they were a supposed victor. So Gibelli says that all these contradictions meant that rather than being boosted by victory in the war, as the ruling elites had intended, the liberal parliamentary system imploded, leading to Europe's first mass reactionary regime, which was fascism. Should just the very brief details about how Mussolini came to power. In April 1919, fascists and nationalists burned down the offices of the National Socialist daily Levante in Milan. 4 people are killed and the paper shut down for several days. The offices are attacked again and again in 1920 and 1922. And this is really the beginning of orchestrated attacks by fascists against socialists or Bolshevists, attacks which found popular support with many Italians. Local fascist groups were soon founded in Emilia, in Tuscany, and in Puglia. And by autumn 1920, were busy not only breaking up strikes, which were socialist motivated, but also destroying socialist and Catholic labour unions and peasants' cooperatives, and often with police collusion, overthrowing newly elected local councils. So within a few months, paramilitary fascist squad leaders controlled many rural areas of central Italy. Local bosses built power bases in various areas, for example, Italo Balbo in Ferrara, Roberto Farinacci in Cremona, and Leandro Arpinati in Bologna. And these men exercised considerable power throughout the fascist period. The fascists had become a major political force, backed not only by landowners, but also by many members of the urban middle class, including students, shopkeepers, and clerical workers. In May 1921, when Prime Minister Giolitti called new elections, 35 fascists were elected to a parliament as part of a government bloc of 275 deputies. In October, Mussolini abandoned republicanism, and in November he formed his movement into a proper political party, the National Fascist Party, the PNF in Italian, the Partito Nazionale Fascista, which was by this time financially solid, if disorganized. You see here on the left the PNF emblem with the bundle of sticks in the center of it. Mussolini manipulated this volatile situation for the next few months to his advantage, and the liberal political establishment desperately tried to build a relationship between him and the fascist militias. The police, the army, and much of the middle class sympathised with the fascist destruction of socialist unions. He became known as Il Duce, the leader of fascism, and he gradually made himself more indispensable in Rome, and squads took over more in the cities, more cities in the provinces. Only a very few areas were able to resist the black shirts in street fighting, including Parma and Bari in 1922. In October 1922, Mussolini organised a march on Rome by fascist supporters. Fascist squads numbering about 25,000 men began to converge on the capital from all over Italy on October 26th, occupying railway stations and government offices. So the march on Rome really marked the beginning of fascist rule and meant the doom of the preceding parliamentary regimes of socialists and liberals. So here you see Mussolini surrounded by some of his followers in the typical black shirt gear with these baggy jodhpur-like trousers, the black shirt, often wearing you can see them there, often wearing their army medals, and often also carrying whips or sticks, and adding to the whole violent scene of these pictures. After the March on Rome on the 31st of October 1922, Mussolini is appointed Prime Minister of Italy and becomes the youngest Prime Minister in the history of the state. He was 39 years of age. He'd been helped by circumstance, but also his rise to power is really because he's really good at controlling media as well as closing down some of the newspapers. He is an excellent agitator. He knew how to give the people what they want. He was really good at seizing opportunities, and he was a showman. Um, he spoke in a really high staccato-like voice, which is quite unusual, but was very, I suppose, hypnotic to listeners. And at rallies, he caught the imagination when he was surrounded, like he was in the earlier picture, by his black shirts. He used every opportunity to take off his shirt and to show how physically fit he was. His style of oratory, the staccato and repetitive oratory, is really superb. The way he posed, he really knew how to capture a camera lens. In earlier pictures, when you see him, you'd hardly notice him, but when you see him in pictures like he is here on the right, when he starts wearing this very distinctive cap and looking upwards with this attitude, you know, he's very good at using the camera. Um, his opinions were often contradictory, his facts were often wrong, and his attacks were frequently malicious. You wouldn't know where he was going to hit. But his words were so dramatic, his metaphors so apt and striking, and these repetitive gestures, he kept doing this with his hand, were so extraordinarily effective that he rarely failed to impose his mood. Italian fascism in style was really focused on hyper-militarism. Think of all those army parades to show strength, and you'll see one there listed there. And also on a citizens' absolute allegiance to the state. On economic corporatism, this is the era when a lot of the big Italian businesses, film and the motor industry, etc., really are given great benefits for growth. That economic corporatism is good for the economic good of all citizens. And also, he tried to recreate the glory of the Roman Empire. That didn't end too well with his ventures into Africa, but nevertheless, it was part of what he was trying to do. His own definition of fascism is in the Doctrine of Fascism, which you can view on the Fordham Internet source books. It's quite a short document, but really telling. And in it, he says that the fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism, he said, is totalitarian, and the fascist state is a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values, and it interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. So this was a way of saying we are the people are us, and we control them as well. So again, there's that picture without text over it, and you can see the black shirt garb there around him. To look then briefly at Nazism, it has its roots too in World War One, but particularly in the defeat and the revolutionary upheaval which follows in Germany. It does also have influences before that in the emergence of radical nationalism at the end of the 19th century, and the new wave of anti-Semitism, which began in the Great Depression of 1873 to 1896. Economy and the loss of empire, the key features of the emergence of German fascism, the overly punitive terms of the Versailles Treaty, which is the treaty that deals with Germany coming out of the Paris Peace Conference, the first recession in 1923, and then the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression of 1929, which really, for all the impact in America, have really hyper impact in Germany. Anti-Semitism is linked into the documents of Nazism from quite early on, even though the perception is that it comes in rather late into the game. In the early years, the new German democracy, the Weimar Republic, set up in the wake of the war and the collapsed empire, faced continuing turmoil. The Treaty of Versailles was quickly labelled the diktat by the German public. In other words, that it was dictated to them, that it didn't have a choice about it, galvanized the resentment that had accumulated during the war, much of which was turned back on to the Republic itself. So it got a bad press, as though it had actually created the Versailles Treaty. And the enemies of the Weimar tend to blame the hated treaty on the Republic's socialist and democratic progenitors, whom they accused of having undermined Germany's efforts in the final stages of the war. A radicalized and revived right wing asked whether the German army might not have been stabbed in the back by traitors on the home front. And there was also the emergence of a fraudulent document made in Russia in 1895, the notorious Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. And racists really latched onto this, was published in Germany in 1920. And this suggested that all of recent history, including World War I, resulted from a conspiracy of Jews seeking to control the world. Of course, this was a fake, but nevertheless, it took traction in Nazi Germany. Another major issue that the Republic faced in the early 1920s was the escalating rate of inflation that eventually nearly did destroy the German mark. It was rooted in the huge debt that Germany had amassed in financing its war effort, but the hyperinflation of 1923 was triggered by the French-Belgian military occupation in January 1923 of the German key industrial district in the Ruhr Valley. The occupation occurred in retaliation for Germany having fallen behind with reparation payments, and was intended to force German industry to provide compensation for the French and Belgian losses. And in response, the German government forced workers and employers to close down the factories. Idle workers were paid during the following months, with the currency inflating so rapidly that printers gave up trying to print the numbers and the bills. By mid-23, the German mark was losing value literally by the minute. A loaf of bread that cost 20,000 marks in the morning could cost 5 million by nightfall. So while the economic collapse eventually came on the 15th of November, it took 4.2 trillion German marks to buy a single American dollar. And the social and political cost of this hyperinflation was really high. And it really undermined the middle class, who had a lot of their savings and pensions wiped out completely. So this was an opportunity for both the left and the right. Communists saw a much improved chance for revolution. Adolf Hitler, the leader of the small National Socialist German Workers' Party, capitalized to merge with other right-wing interests and attempted a coup in November 23, the very key beer hall putsch, seeking to use Bavaria to orchestrate a nationalist march on Berlin, echoing Mussolini's March on Rome. Why Bavaria? It was the home of the Nazi Party. It found a better home there than in other parts of Germany. There were several similar Völkisch groups which sprang up there in 1919. In March 1920, a right-wing group exploited the disorder called by an earlier putsch, the Kapp putsch, to carry out their own coup in Bavaria and replace the local socialist government with a right-wing regime. And under the Weimar Constitution, the police were responsible to federal states rather than to central or right government. So in many other states, police harried right-wing extremists, but in Bavaria, because of the new regime, they had a safe haven. So it was an atmosphere in which fascism could thrive. Hitler and his party hoped to overthrow the democratic system of the Weimar that he believed was responsible for Germany's political and economic humiliation. Neither left nor right in the event was able to capitalize on events, because the government sponsored a currency reform that re-stabilized the mark, and also decided to end its policy of passive resistance in the Ruhr in exchange for an end to the occupation and a reschedule of the reparation debts. But ultimately, this is seen as the first stage of Nazi Germany, just like Mussolini's march on Rome. And the German Nazi Party was able to build on the inflation of 23 and again on the Great Depression to persuade more and more Germans to support the party. It's able to position itself as a defense against the threat of communism. And in this, the financial difficulties also played straight into its hand. The Great Depression affected Germany really badly, once more causing an economic crisis. But there is also a rapid rise in unemployment, which provided millions of jobless and dissatisfied voters. And the Nazis are able to exploit this disaffection to its advantage. And between 1929 and 1932, the party increased its membership and voting strength. And really, this culminates eventually in the Enabling Act, which is in March 33, when the right government issues laws without the consent of Germany's parliament. and really that Hitler eventually, under the Enabling Act, becomes a dictator. Just to briefly refer, if we've really run out of time, to other fascistic movements in other countries in the interwar period. We have Oswald Mosley's British National Front, Owen O'Duffy's Blue Shirts. In Austria, you have Dollfuss's The Fatherland Front. You have Salazar's National Union in Portugal, Jonas Metaxas's party in Greece, Ustasa in Croatia. In Hungary, you have Gombas's movement. And then in Norway, you have the National Samling, led by Vidkun Quisling, and of course the military dictatorship of Hideki in Japan as well. That's Mosley there. And that's Owen O'Duffy there. You can look at the links there to the various stories. And finally, there's some readings on fascism there that I might just draw your attention to, including down there at the bottom, the German Historical Institute has resources on Weimar Germany and on Nazi Germany there. So I'll stop sharing there now and just see if you have any questions. And thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Ida. If anyone has any questions just before we finish up, you can pop them into the Q&A box. If you're showing this lecture to classes later and have questions, you can comment on the YouTube videos and I can pass on the questions to Ida to provide an answer and we'll post up the answers to them. Okay, so we have a question, Ida. Any specific articles on the Nuremberg rallies?
I don't have any to hand, but I can have a look for some and send them to you, Paul, if Dennis or other, if that's okay. Or if you want to send me an email, I'll send you some links to them if you like.
Perfect. And maybe that's something, if you can pop in the slides or something, Ida, and because I'll be sending the slides out with everyone afterwards as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And we'll include them in the slides then. Okay, so we might finish up. Thank you to everyone who joined us today for our history lecture, and a special thanks to Ida for delivering a really insightful lecture today. Our next lecture will be on the 2nd of December with lecturer in English literature, Dr. James Heaney, and he's going to take an in-depth look at the prescribed English text, The Crucible by Arthur Miller. This lecture is open to 5th and 6th year students and teachers, and you can register on our website at carlowcollege.au. So this concludes today's lecture. Thanks again for everyone for coming.